we continue to inch towards a major war. Now, ideally, cooler heads will prevail, but just last week, Lindsey Graham was making the news rounds calling for us to bomb Iran. In fact, he was saying we should, quote, blow Iran off the map. That's probably not a surprise coming from Lindsey Graham, but it's really definitely, could you imagine being Iran and hearing this type of stuff? This came shortly after Israel killed an Iranian general in an airstrike in Syria. So are we headed for a wider war? Why do Israel and the U.S. hate Iran in the first place? Why did the Iran nuclear deal fall apart? Why did Trump take out Soleimani? And why hasn't Iran, more importantly, why hasn't Iran, luckily, in a lot of ways, responded to these provocations? With us tonight is Trita Parsi. Trita is an Iranian-born author and analyst. He is the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is a DC-based think tank that opposes the military-industrial complex and advocates for restraint in U.S. foreign policy. Trita is also the founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council, which looked to promote a greater understanding between the American and Iranian people. He is the author of Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the United States, A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, and his latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. Trita, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's hope it's a happy year, not just a happy new year, but a whole happy year, and that there's no war. But it looks like we're getting closer. Let's start off with why Iran. Why do you think Iran hasn't responded harshly to the provocations? They do small responses, but they haven't allowed anything at this point. And there's been a lot of provocations against Iran over the years. They haven't allowed any of it to escalate to a wider war.
It is a great question because there's a debate raging inside of Iran right now, and there are more and more voices, particularly amongst the hawkish elements of the regime, that believe that Iran's deterrence against Israel is falling apart and Iran has to respond.
Ugh.
And the other side of the debate are those who say that Iran has to play the long game, a confrontation directly with Israel and the Israelis is something that Iran likely would lose. It would be extremely costly for the United States and certainly for Israel, but it wouldn't have the favorable outcome. But if they play the long game, and if just take a look what's happened in the last 10 years, Iran is the main reason as to why Hezbollah is such a powerful military force. It's a key reason as to why the Houthis now have the technology that they do, in which they've been able to target ships in the Red Sea, why they've been able to defeat the Saudis, etc. So the longer game is part of the reason why the Iranians have not responded. But we don't know. Perhaps at this point there will be a response from the Iranians and there will be a direct confrontation. Now, the Iranian red line, as it has been communicated, is that they will not respond unless Iran is hit on Iranian soil. It's the same red line that the Lebanese Hezbollah has put forward, in which they say that they will not enter the war in Gaza unless Israel invades Lebanon. Now, of course, there's skirmishes between between Hezbollah and Israel going on all the time, but that's unfortunately almost always the case. It's certainly intensified since Gaza, but not in a way that it's actually escalated into a much larger war. But so that's the official red line. Can they sustain that red line if there are not only more attacks in Gaza, which we will see, potentially an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and on top of that, further Israeli assassinations of Iran?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I understand that logic coming from them, but they have been sabotaged quite a bit by the Israelis. I mean, I don't know if it's been confirmed, but there's certainly been a lot of suspicion that the Israelis had been taking out a lot of their infrastructure inside of Iran.
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Israelis, one can definitely make the argument that the Israelis have humiliated the Iranians in many different ways. They've taken out a lot of their different scientists as well as leaders of their missile program. A very key person in the Iranian nuclear program was assassinated inside of Iran by an AI robot. I mean, it was taken straight out of a James Bond movie in which they had smuggled the pieces in, assembled it, inside of Iran. And then, by remote control in Israel, they took out this very senior person from the Iranian nuclear program. On the other hand, you can also make this argument, which is that all of these different things that the Israelis have done, including, incidentally, the Stuxnet virus that they, together with the US, put in the Iranian nuclear program that destroyed big parts of it, that all of them have done tremendous damage to the Iranian program, to Iran's military, but none of them have had a strategic impact on the trajectory of Iran's military program as well as its civilian nuclear program. So, for instance, the Iranian drones, the missile capabilities they have are still by and large intact. They've been set back, but the Iranians have bounced back. The nuclear program is more advanced than it ever has been. So one can also make the argument that playing the long game has worked out for the Iranians instead of, let's say, if they had really lashed out a year ago or 5 years ago and there would have been a major war, what would the situation have looked then for the Iranians?
I got to be honest, if I were Iran, I'd be scrambling to get myself some nukes. I mean, this whole, that's just from a logical perspective. We've seen also recently there were calls from, I think there was France and the UK and the United States telling Iran, hey, tone it down with your nuclear program. We see that you're escalating it. We want you to stop it. I mean, look, if they wanted Iran to stop it, they would have done the Iran nuclear deal, I suppose, stayed in it, and we could get to that. But why would Iran listen to them? I mean, when I saw that news that, they've written, they've told Iran to back it down, I'm thinking, why would they listen to you at all after you take out a general? Have Lindsey Graham on the news saying things like, let's blow Iran off the map. If I were Iran, the only thing I'd be focused on at this point is getting myself some nukes, especially since Israel has nukes. We know they've got nukes. It's unconfirmed, which is the worst type because you can't inspect them. So they've got how many warheads? 400 warheads or something, nukes, and we can't even inspect them because they're off the books. So why is Israel allowed to have all of these nukes and Iran's not allowed to have nukes to defend itself when it's got warmongers saying, let's blow it off the map? I mean, if I were them, I'd be scrambling.
So I think the logic you're presenting makes sense if Iran was only focusing on the United States. If it's only focusing on the United States, it's seeing this threat, it's seeing the rhetoric, the attacks by Israel, etc. And a conclusion can then be reached that, yes, if Iran had nukes, it would have the deterrence against this. Certainly, the Israelis would not be doing a lot of these different things if Iran had nukes, and nor would the US. But Iran's calculation, I think, is a bit more complicated and wider than that. And that's what it's been so far. I'm not saying that this is the way it's going to stay. I think, in fact, there is a likelihood that it will change. But part of the reason why the Iranians, contrary to the assumption in Washington, in my view, were never dead set on getting a nuke. Their calculation was different. Even during the time of the Shah, the Iranians were trying to get all of the technology necessary to be able to have a nuclear weapon, but then stay short of actually building the weapon. And the reason for that was this. Iran's major advantage in the region is its conventional strength. It is one of the largest countries in the region. Its geographic situation makes it one of the most strategically important nations in the world. It has a population of 80 million. It has a scientific industrial base that, at least up until recently, was the second strongest in the region. It has its own military industrial base. As long as the region is non-nuclear, with the exception of Israel, Iran is a regional superpower. But if Iran builds a nuclear weapon and risks spreading nuclear weapons in the region, because the Saudis have said that they will build one if Iran has one, Turkey will build one if Iran has one, then suddenly, to a large extent, Iran's conventional military superiority will be erased, and Iran will find itself in a very different strategic environment. Let's just take an example. An Israeli general told me this. He said that India was 10 times the size of Pakistan up until India tested a nuclear bomb. Once it tested a nuclear bomb and Pakistan tested a nuclear bomb, they were equals. And that was a huge strategic mistake for the Indians. This would be the equivalent of Iran going for a nuclear weapon and then Bahrain building or buying one. And then suddenly Iran, that is like, what, 30, 40 times the size of Bahrain, would find itself equal, at parity with Bahrain. So there's a reason why the two most populous countries in the region, Egypt and Iran, introduced the resolution, the idea of a non-nuclear Middle East at the UN in 1973, Iran and Egypt, because those are the two countries that have the most to lose if the region goes nuclear. Israel, which is a very small state with no strategic depth, has a completely different calculation. Now, Washington's decision makers really never took this into account, but they assumed that Iran was like Pakistan. And that, as you know, famously, the Pakistanis said that they will eat grass, but they will have a nuclear weapon. They will give up everything to have that nuclear weapon. Well, Pakistan is a relatively smaller country next to a giant India, and as a result, had that calculation. Iran did not. In fact, the Iranian nuclear program has been going on for more than 50 years. They still don't have a nuclear weapon. The Pakistanis built a nuclear weapon from scratch in 9.5 years. If the Iranians wanted a nuclear weapon, if it was really the singular thing that they were most focused on, most likely they would have had it by now. And we have to ask ourselves then, why don't they? Which is the question you asked. And I think, again, it goes to the fact that there's a much more complex geopolitical calculation that they have. All of this can change, however, particularly if the threat from the United States, as perceived by the Iranians, becomes so acute that that ends up becoming the dominant variable in their calculation. In that scenario, then I think it is feasible that they may actually make the calculation that they're better off going for bomb. There is a group of, there is a voice inside the Iranian regime that is growing stronger, that is essentially making the argument that given what happened with the JCPOA, the West will never accept Iran. And Iran is already paying the cost of having a nuclear weapon because of all of these sanctions. So it might as well just build one. And I think that voice is getting stronger inside of Iran. I think it would be to the detriment of the region as a whole. I think it would be less safe of a world if more countries had a nuclear weapon. But I think also the miscalculation and wrongful policy on the Western side has been a very strong contributor and will be a very strong contributor if the Iranians go in that direction.
But you bring up a really good point. Well, for one, I'd like to just kind of emphasize the fact that the Middle Eastern countries, as much as the West, you know, you've got a lot of people who believe, oh, Muslims, they're really violent people, and yet where are all the nukes? The nukes are with the West primarily. And you've got the Middle East there saying we don't want to be nuclearized. We want a peaceful, non-nuclear region, which is very smart, especially since there are factions that we absolutely would not want to have nukes in their hands, have nukes falling into the hands of real terrorist organizations. That would be devastating. But then again, who's the only country in the world that's ever dropped a nuke, right? Who's the real terrorist? I don't know. Or I do know. So that's just kind of an interesting thing to emphasize there, is to really say, look, the Middle East has remained, and it's not because they don't have the capacity. I mean, Iran has a very high rate of scientists, and science is very big in Iran. There are a lot of scientists in Iran, women and men, so they have absolutely capability and the brain power to develop anything that they want in that country, from my understanding.
Certainly.
The other thing is, looking at the map, the placement of Iran, very difficult, it would seem, to go to war with Iran. It has geographically an excellent position with water around it. You've got, you know, Afghanistan on one side and Iraq on the other, and I know that's pretty scary, right, for Iran. They could think that that's kind of a scary proposition with the Americans that were in Afghanistan, same thing with Iraq, but America was not successful in those areas. So the risk of, sure, if the United States had been successful and were stronger in those areas, I could see a threat to Iran, but the fact that the United States was not successful in those areas means that Iran is safer from any sort. So I guess the question would be, what would a war even look like? Like, what would be because it's not a territorial gain. Lebanon, I could understand because Israel could take Lebanon. So if there was a war that broke out between those two, that would maybe be the gain that Israel would get would be to actually occupy or annex Lebanon. But what do you do with Iran? I mean, would you think that, like, how would Iran lose?
Look, war with Iran would be a complete disaster. You pointed out that, the US was not successful in Afghanistan and in Iraq. I mean, of course, in Iraq, there was a military defeat of Saddam within just 3 weeks, but winning the peace and winning the war are two different things.
Right.
In Afghanistan, ultimately, there was also a military defeat, of course. But Iran is 4 times the size. Population is much larger. Geography is very, very different from Iraq. Mountainous, very difficult to penetrate. The Romans got stopped by the Persians. The Ottomans got stopped by the Persians, partly because of the geography. So it will be extremely difficult. So then the argument is, oh, it's not going to be an invasion. It's just going to be surgical strikes, taking out their capabilities, etc. That will never be successful. It would mean that the Israelis would have to do the mowing the grass type of strategy that they're currently doing in Gaza every 2 years, bombard the place. All we know is that in such scenarios, the program would just go underground. All of the inspectors that currently actually are inside the Iranian nuclear program with the IAEA would be kicked out, and we would have no idea what's going on. And it's a pretty large country. You have plenty of places to be able to hide things if that is what you're trying to do. So there's no scenario that I've seen that actually would make a war with Iran a success. I saw one assessment by the Pentagon that listed that to actually truly be successful, you have to invade the country. You would have to have minimum of 500,000 troops, as well as several 100,000 troops from allied countries in Europe, etc. And it would have to be a commitment of about 10 years in order for this to be successful. So this is a disaster. This is not something that the United States can afford. And I think what the Biden administration is doing right and wrong right now, I think it's wise in recognizing that any escalation, any widening of the war of Gaza would be a disaster. But I think it's wrong in the way that it thinks that it can contain that war, because all it does right now, we can go into it deep, is try to deter Iran and the Houthis and Hezbollah, which is one element of it, but it cannot be the only element. The most important element is to also put pressure on the Israelis. In fact, the most obvious way of evading an enlarged war that would bring in Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran would be to have a ceasefire in Gaza. But the most obvious path, the most obvious option is the one that Biden seems the least inclined to pursue.
Yeah, because I don't know if he's in charge anymore. I mean, clearly, it looks like Israel has. I don't know if this has always been the case, and we've just been under the illusion that Israel's the little brother to the United States and that the United States is really in charge. But at some point, I mean, it's really clear now that Israel doesn't care what the United States says, is not listening, and is
I would
really
challenge
what's in
that a little bit,
charge.
Kim. I would challenge that a little bit, Kim. I think that is frankly the narrative that the Biden administration is putting forward, that the
Oh,
Israelis are just
interesting.
not going to listen. I don't think that's the thing. I think what's happening is that the Biden administration is not even trying. They're not actually putting any pressure on the Israelis. If the United States were to actually put pressure on Israel, make any military support contingent upon Israel living up to our demands, then we have historical examples in which it has worked out quite well. 1982, President Reagan got tired of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It wasn't looking good. The evening news was showing it. People in America were turning against the Israelis. And he put pressure on Menachem Begin, and they had a phone call. And he said, I'm not going to send you any more F-16s. I'm going to make this public until you pull out. Within half hour, the Israelis shifted and they made a decision to pull out. So when we actually put pressure and we put forward consequences, the United States has tremendous amount of leverage. I'm not saying it's easy.
Yeah.
The cost, however, is politically for the president, domestic political cost. And I think what's happening here is that Biden doesn't want to pay the political cost domestically for putting pressure on Israel. It's not that the Israelis won't listen, they don't care. It's true, they don't care because we haven't made them care. We can make them care, but Biden doesn't want.
Yeah, I guess I think in my mind, the money must out. It always comes down to money, because that would be our leverage on Israel is the money. It's whether or not we're going to give you money, we're going to give you or things of value that cost money, right? So it's a money game. It seems that the domestic money that is flowing into these campaigns is greater than perhaps the money that we give to Israel. So we're more dependent on our side on the Israeli lobby money than Israel is reliant on US aid money. And so because it's outweighed, they have more power. I mean, that's what it looks like from my viewpoint.
So I think you're putting your finger on something very important, which is that there is a tremendous amount of money that is going around to specific candidates, as long as they're taking very strong pro-Israeli positions. But we have to then also separate that. That is not that the US has to do so. This is politicians making bad decisions and going for what's good for them, not what's good for the country.
Right.
And it's a major, major problem.